Hello and welcome to this election edition of Represent NYC on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm Ben Max, Executive Editor of Gotham Gazette. The general election is Tuesday, November 8th, finally putting an end to this controversial and contentious presidential race. Political bombshells rained down on the two major party candidates this past week, and now we're in the final stretch. With me today are Dr. Christina Greer, Associate Professor of Political Science at Fordham University and author of Black Ethnics, and Dr. Lincoln Mitchell, Columbia University scholar and author of The Democracy Promotion Paradox. Thank you both for being here.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you.
Election day is right here upon us. What are we looking for in the final hours? Is there anything that you're most looking for to see how something breaks one way or another to measure what the results will be on election day, either in the presidential race or there are, of course, congressional races as well?
Mm-hmm. I'm looking for closure and peace of mind on November 8th. I'm really curious to see what turnout will look like. You know, even in 2008 when we were so excited about Obama and its record turnout, it's still, you know, roughly 60% of the voting eligible population that actually turned out. So some of the narratives say, you know, even though people aren't as excited about Clinton and Trump, because this is such an important election, we may see it greater than 60%. So I want to know who's turning out, but also the states that are really going to be participatory. You know, we've heard some things about North Carolina and the suppression of early voting, especially among African Americans. This is the first time we're going to the polls without the full protection of the VRA. And so I really do wonder how that'll affect, you know, largely swing states, Ohio, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Florida, Indiana to a certain extent, you know, is sort of out of the picture because of Pence, but, you know, he was pretty unpopular as a governor and could have possibly lost his seat. So there are quite a few purple states that I'm curious about.
Right, yeah, let's come back to swing states in a minute.
I would just add something to that that's related. You know, Donald Trump has talked a lot about this kind of voter fraud, which isn't a real thing, but it's something that may be real in his head. And he has encouraged people to what he might describe as, you know, check to make sure there's no voter fraud, but what in plain English sounds like intimidate voters of color. So what I'm looking for is, are we going to see that in Pennsylvania, specifically in a place like Philadelphia, in Ohio, in a place like Cleveland? Are we going to see a harassment of these voters as a way to suppress turnout? That would be very, very troubling. That's something we'll only know on Tuesday, but that's what I would be looking for right now.
Mm-hmm. And so as we approach Election Day, what do we think right now, based on polls, based on history, based on your sense of things, your magic 8-ball, whatever, what do we think it looks like in the presidential race, in the Senate, in the House?
Well, in the presidential race, we know this is not going to be a landslide for Clinton. That would surprise me. However, there are some things that we may want to keep an eye on. One is, we've heard a little bit about this kind of secret Trump vote, right? Are there people who are, you know, embarrassed to say they're going to vote for Trump because there's some stigma attached? Of course, we don't know the answer to that.
Embarrassed to say it when a
right,
pollster
to a pollster,
polls,
or even to their friends.
Or to their friends.
Or even to their friends. But there may also be a secret Clinton vote. And what comes to mind there is Geraldine Ferraro, who of course is a congresswoman from Queens, who became the first woman nominated for a major party on a national ticket, once said, Archie Bunker didn't elect me to Congress, Edith did. And I'm wondering whether around the country there are women who have said, you know what, I'm not going to argue with my husband every day about this, but in the privacy of the voting booth, I actually find this guy Donald Trump kind of disgusting, and I'm going to vote for Hillary Clinton. So there may be a hidden Clinton vote as well. I think that with regards to the Senate, look, there's a couple of key races, Nevada, North Carolina. We have to see how those play out. That could go either way, but it's a good shot for the Democrats to win that. The revelations about the FBI ongoing investigation, which then became the kind of Jim Comey scandal as that went on, where I think we may see an impact of that is that kind of puts the House out of reach for the Democrats. I don't think the Democrats are poised on the kind of landslide that would bring Christine Pelosi back as Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi.
You know, I call what Lincoln said the Sarah Palin effect, and we saw this in 2008, where there were lots of Republican women who didn't want to argue with their husbands, but they felt very uncomfortable about Sarah Palin, and they quietly voted for Obama. So I agree. I think that there are many people who either aren't being polled who were Trump supporters, you know, and sort of first-time voters on the national scale. I do think that there are some independents or weak-leaning Democrats who hate Hillary Clinton for whatever host of reasons, but in their communities, they do not feel comfortable saying that they're going to vote for someone who's perceived as a racist, anti-Semitic, misogynist, you know, anti-Islamic, homophobic, the list goes on, charlatan. But I do think that there are some women Republican women who are really disgusted by him and quite frankly confused as to how he's gotten this far with, cases pending, literal cases pending for sexual assault. As far as the Senate is concerned, I mean, this is, my political science brain says that Hillary Clinton does have a path to 270. It is possible. We saw Obama won, without Florida. So, like, if you look at the math and the way demographics and migration patterns are moving, it looks great, not just for Hillary Clinton, but Democrats moving forward in the next few cycles. The Senate, is another question, and in Congress in general, just because, Obama had a rough time negotiating with Congress, largely because he didn't really know D.C. and, who's fairly new to the political process in that sphere. Hillary Clinton has a different uphill battle, which is there are many people who just dislike her. And so many people in Congress disliked Obama largely because of race and they didn't really know him. There are people in Congress, Democrats included, who dislike her for quote unquote substantive reasons. And I really do worry if she can't bring in enough senators on her coattails down the ticket, and even some members of the House, I really wonder if she'll ever be able to get anything done on her agenda just because of the personal gridlock that she's going to face.
That's fascinating because she has this reputation that some people are willing to say and others not willing to say that she's pretty good at coming to bipartisan compromise. So there's some questions, and maybe now is not the best time to get too into this, but there's some questions about if she is elected, if the dust settles and she's actually more apt than President Obama has been at moving forward some things. And he even said this, I think, as recent as yesterday or today, that he said, she's probably going to be better than me at coming to agreement with Republicans on things like infrastructure funding because she has that history.
And she's a hawk.
She has that, and she's a hawk. She has that skill set. So we have a different president coming in than we had in 2009 when President Obama took office.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but is this a foregone conclusion? Is she definitely going to win?
It's very likely.
Okay.
It's very likely. It's not money in the bank, but it's very likely.
I'll put it this way. My political science brain says yes when I look at the electoral map. I'm a Black American in this country. I am not convinced that, prayer is something that I'm relying on, but I'm not convinced just because of voter fraud on the Trump end, voter intimidation, the fact that we don't have the protection of the ERA, the fact that some people aren't as excited and possibly don't understand the stakes that we face with a possible Trump presidency. So I am a little worried. As a citizen,
quantitatively, you feel like it's
quantitatively,
happening?
I think it's possible, but as a citizen,
I mean, the Republicans are going to have a tough time in this race, no matter who they nominated. And they kind of got lucky that the Democrats nominated Hillary Clinton. If this were Jeb Bush versus Martin O'Malley, Jeb Bush would have a tough time because the electoral map lines up in favor of the Democrats. Now, they both nominating unusual candidates with some real weaknesses, electorally speaking. I'm not talking about in character necessarily, but just on the numbers. And that makes it kind of closer and more volatile than it would be. What I was also going to say is that going in, when Hillary was in the Senate, it was a different America, right? And it was a different partisan structure. And one of the differences that in the first decade of the 21st century, Republicans and Democrats had really different visions about how to govern this country. And that made governance difficult, but it made it possible because you could talk about and arrive at compromises. In 2017, the differences are this. The Democrats have a vision of governing this country. Some may agree with that vision, some may not. And the Republicans' vision is simply to not govern, right? So when you say we're not
govern from Washington.
To not govern from Washington. When you say we're not going to, it's not we want a better Supreme Court justice than Merrick Garland, which frankly you're not going to get if you're a Republican, right? But we will not meet with any Supreme Court justice, right? So, the Constitution is a document that is strong because of the mores and conventions surrounding it. And if we have a Republican Congress, that even if they have, even if they don't have an exact majority in the Senate, but enough to create problems, if they want to stop and stop and stop, they can do that against a president who is, if we want to speak in kind of truth rather than kind of Republican fantasy, who is a centrist, right? Who is a hawk on military issues, who is a progressive on issues of kind of tolerance and diversity, but who is not not some great lefty on economic issues. There was plenty of room to work with President Clinton for conservative solutions to America's problems. But if your goal is to not have solutions to any problems and to destroy the president, then President Clinton would have a very, very difficult time.
Well, especially because Republicans have already sworn to be obstructionists, right? And so because Americans prefer divided government, which, we saw that in 2010, right? I mean, Democrats included did not like the fact that, Democrats controlled the House, the Senate, and the presidency. So we always sort of shake ourselves out in recent memory to divided government. But citizens don't like gridlock and deadlock. And that is the fear that I have with a Clinton presidency, where this obstructionist Congress in this new 21st century way of governance is that they will make sure that she has zero agenda so that she'll hopefully be a one-term president.
Paul Ryan, the Republican Speaker of the House, says he already voted early in Wisconsin and voted for Donald Trump, but he has not been behind him. And some of me wonders, in some ways, if he'd rather work with a President Clinton.
I think he'd rather have a President Clinton and not work with her, right? The problem that, the Republicans are in a rough situation here because the thing that might even be worse than a Donald Trump defeat is a Donald Trump victory, right? Because then you have to go along with politics what do you do when President Trump proposes a policy on Ukraine that is radically different than the consensus within the Republican Party, right? These are in some respects more serious problems for Paul Ryan. Paul Ryan, let's say for the sake of argument, the Republicans win control of both houses of Congress and Hillary Clinton gets elected. This is the divided government scenario. In that scenario, Paul Ryan is the most visible Republican in Washington because Mitch McConnell, a skillful senator, not exactly the most dynamic, telegenic guy in the world. Donald Trump may remain the most visible Republican in America because who knows what he will do with his marbles. I mean that both euphemistically and in the colloquial sense after he loses, right? He might decide, as Newt Gingrich has floated, to just have a series of kind of floating rallies all around the country just to get people angry and racist because we don't have enough of that in America, right? Or he may retire to Mar-a-Lago. We just don't know. But Paul Ryan becomes the Republican man in Washington. That's something with which Paul Ryan has become comfortable. Trying to work through policy with an erratic President Trump who doesn't even hew true to conservative principles could put Mr. Ryan in a very, very difficult situation.
Right. He's already in a very tough position because his House is more divided than the Senate Republicans are because you have that strong Tea Party element and so many more members and all sorts of difficult waters to navigate there. I want to bring us back to New York for a few minutes because New Yorkers are mostly watching this program. And New York is not a swing state, although Trump and his folks talked for a while about trying to win New York. It just looks like that's totally out of the question. It's pretty much looked like that from the first polls. But what are some things that seem to be at stake for New Yorkers here? The New York vote will matter, it seems, less in the Electoral College, more in just the total vote count, which people do look at. There are key swing House races in New York that could influence the balance of power there, although it seems like Democrats might have a very tough time swinging control back. What are some of the key issues that matter in a Trump versus a Clinton or a divided government in Washington?
Well, New York, to me, the most serious one is this. New York is a state with a lot of Latinos, a lot of African Americans, a lot of Jews, a lot of gay people, and actually a lot of Muslims too, right? If you fit in one of those groups, it matters a lot in this election, whether or not, even if New York isn't a swing state, right? The bigotry that has been encouraged and facilitated by the Republican nominee in a way, and towards all those groups, I'm not picking on one or the other, but towards all those groups, and also the kind of misogyny as well, this hits New Yorkers more. Because this is the capital of American Jewry, right? This is one of the capitals of the African American kind of American culture, right?
And the immigrant experience.
And the immigrant and the Muslim America. So New York is this is ironically because he is I'm embarrassed to say he's from the same born in the same city that I was, but he has picked this fight with people who live in this city and this state. So a Trump presidency makes this a much more difficult country for many, many New Yorkers just because of the color of our skin, who we love, who we worship, our chromosomes, all of those things.
But, going back, though, Lincoln, to your point about him being such an erratic person, I always remind people that all states are red states. There are parts of New York that I wouldn't step foot in because there are many New Yorkers who do not believe in different religions, different races, different sexual orientations. So I do think, though, that Trump would be, I think he's dangerous on a host of levels, but economically he would be dangerous. We have fracking issues that we need to really think about, public health and sort of environmental issues. I think he would be incredibly dangerous. We know that this man will tank this country to make 25 cents. So whatever it is, Hillary Clinton is being pushed to the left by Bernie and his supporters. So she's trying to think more substantively about incarceration, the carceral state. how we think about prisons and, you know, moving black and brown bodies from downstate, upstate to sort of prop up these poor communities. So in a Clinton presidency, I think she'd think holistically about how do we negotiate these changing times where we just can't keep propping up poor white communities with urban black and Latino men and women, whereas Trump, you know, we don't really know much about how he thinks about incarceration, but we do know what he thinks about race. We do know what he thinks about immigrants. We would see a lot more ICE detention centers. You know, he's gotten support from that union. We'd see a lot more, you know, police enforcement, sort of security for, you know, this militaristic idea of police. He's gotten those endorsements from those types of unions, police unions. So I think we'd be moving into a really dangerous place where the hyper-surveillance of Muslims, the hyper-surveillance of immigrants, the hyper-surveillance of blacks and Latinos, the hyper-surveillance of people getting shot on the street every day, which is such a 1980s, you know, caricature of New York City, but he's stuck in 1980s. That's how he sees not just the city, but that's how he sees people of color in this city. And so I think that we'd be going in sort of a Rudy Giuliani-esque extremist way of governance in urban places, not just New York, but Rochester, Syracuse, Buffalo, that would be really dangerous for not just poor people or lower class people of color, but for just people of color and Muslim people, full stop.
You're going to respond to something, or?
Well, I mean, to me, a Trump presidency, you know, would be a problem for all of these reasons. It would also be a real test for American political institutions, right? Hillary Clinton is running for president as somebody who understands the play between the executive and legislative and judicial branch of Congress, understands what the Constitution is, the Bill of Rights, what the president can and cannot do. It's not my line, but Donald Trump is running for dictator. And what he has done throughout this campaign the last 17, 18 months, and I don't mean this in an entirely negative way, is he has exploited the weakness of existing institutions, right? So he ran a bulldozer through the Republican Party because he got it in a way that the Republican elites didn't. But to take that bulldozer, pardon the odd metaphor, but to take that bulldozer to American political institutions could be potentially devastating, particularly because a Trump presidency would beg to be controlled or limited by precisely those institutions, by a court that says, hey, that's illegal, by a Senate that says, we're not going to go along with that bizarre treaty you want to make with Russia. But what concerns me, I mean, if you want to get really down that road, is the mobilizing of people to get outside of that so that he can apply pressure to pass these things. And the reason this ties back to New York is that the way he's going to mobilize those people is not by saying, let's have a rally to get along with Putin, right? Or let's have a rally to dramatically lower the taxes on richest Americans, right? Which are parts of his platform. It's going to be, let's have a rally to blame this scapegoat, to address this made-up problem, whether it's immigrants committing, you know, huge numbers of crimes, or widespread voter fraud, or the Jews controlling the media, or whatever it is. These are all sentiments. I mean, this is if I had said this if I had said this sentence to you 30 years ago when I was running around San Francisco with hair down to here, you would have dismissed me as a left-wing crazy person, right? But here we are in 2016, and these are real things that have been said either, frankly, by the presidential candidate or by the person around him. And this will be a real test, should he win, for our institutions.
So the odds seem to be that he won't win, although we don't know what's going to happen. These elements that his candidacy has encouraged and has sort of brought out of the woodwork to some extent, there's elements of xenophobia, homophobia, racism, sexism out in the open all the time, but these elements normalized. But there's certain elements that have very much been, you know, pushed out of the mainstream a bit that have really come. I mean, you know, the KKK, for example, is now. I mean, David Duke hasn't had so much publicity in years, right? So some of these elements that have come out that he's encouraged or not denounced, or if he loses, what happens with those elements? Do they recede?
Well, see, and I think that is what worries so many people, right? He has unearthed this, or I usually say excavated, you know, this very real white supremacist faction that has always existed in this country. And black folks have known this. no one really wanted to believe us, but we've always said, it's like these Confederate flags, that's a symbol and it means something. It's very deliberate. And so the fact that he's got thousands of people who have essentially found a safe space, right? And a leader who says, it's okay, like you don't have to be PC. You can say that you hate these people because I do too, wink, wink, right? And so he's been playing footsie with these and these different types of white supremacists. Not all white supremacy is the same. So I mean, he's played with all the different types of factions of white supremacy. So the question is, where do they go? They are now emboldened and mobilized to a certain extent. You know, will they actually accept the fact that Hillary Clinton is president? Donald Trump said, we'll have to wait and see whether he accepts it, right? So they're gonna follow his lead in many ways. We know that he will not go quietly into the night. We know that he will likely exploit them so he can make some money off of them. We know that he will consistently blame other people for why they don't have, largely because he doesn't pay his taxes. So, I mean, these are, you know, he's capitalizing on sort of some of the least educated people, some of the angriest white people in this country, because the country has not provided them with the American dream.
He's going to have a lot tougher time, I think, being a gadfly of sorts with a Hillary Clinton presidency than he did with a Barack Obama presidency, I think, with some of this element. But now that he's whipped people up into a fervor and he has millions and millions of email addresses and phone numbers,
know about the database.
We'll see what happens there.
But here's, sorry, really quickly though, I think it's also going to be on the media to ignore him.
Right.
We know he feeds off of attention. And
How's
I mean,
that gonna go?
I know, but I've been really critical of the media because part of the reason why he is where he is because they've been obsessed with the one candidate who understood the media, right? When he was on the dais with 16 other people, he's the only 21st century candidate.
Sure. But
he understands
that's
how
exactly
it works.
right. I'm sorry to interrupt, but he understands the 21st century. It's not on the media, because the New York Times did a pretty good job of reporting on Trump, right? I mean, you know, they greet CNN with, you know, names and epithets and kind of anti-Semitic names when they come to the rallies, right? The problem is Donald Trump he is the 21st century candidate, and particularly the 2016 candidate. He understands. Trump became a front in the Republican primary. If you, as I suspect you did too, had the bizarre pleasure of having, or I use that word sarcastically, of having to follow all the major candidates on Twitter because you had to see what they were saying, right? They were all saying things that looked like they'd been vetted by a committee of 10 people. Bernie Sanders would say, in the richest country in the world, we shouldn't have people who don't have health care. Well, that's probably true. It's not going to inspire me, right? Ted Cruz would say, you know, Barack Obama is a liberal who's destroying America. I don't necessarily agree with that, but that's standard GOP nonsense. Donald Trump would say just crazy stuff. And what he understood was how that medium worked. It has to be organic. It has to be real. I don't know that the media can stop Donald Trump. They don't have to put the rallies on television full-time all the time. And Trump TV may or may not become a real thing. But he's created these structures to keep himself out there. The question is, you know, how can he make a buck off these people? Yeah. Or at least show the world that he's making a buck? Because in fact, he hasn't made that much money. Donald Trump is an heir, not a businessman, right? But at least create that image for what he has to be able to do. What Donald Trump's agenda, I think here, after, should he lose, is one, how do I tell myself I actually won?
Yes.
And that's I was robbed, right? Because if you surround yourself by people who say it was rigged, you may not do anything about it, but at least for someone like him, he thinks it was rigged. And how do, you know, that being in front of that crowd, getting the cheers, that's a drug. And he obviously enjoys that drug a lot. So he may continue doing that, whether or not it has an impact on the polls or anything like that. But it is just going around the country, seeding, as in dropping seeds, of ugliness and hatred. And you know, when you ask what will happen, one thing we haven't talked about in this interchange is what would a President Hillary Clinton do in that situation, right? This is not a problem that she can address by crafting a policy to offer something to low-income white communities, right? It's not going to be quite that simple.
It's not about that.
She's not going to solve this problem by going out there. I mean, she'd be President of the United States. She's got to go to all 50 states. You're the President of everybody. But she's not going to solve this problem by going into those communities and listening and let me hear your problems. This has kind of gotten beyond that.
Yeah.
Well, let's flip this a little bit, and one question I have for you is, what good for this country has a Donald Trump candidacy created? I think that we've touched on this a little bit. There's one element of a media reckoning that has been fostered here, right? That the media has had to look inward in some ways, and we've seen a bit of a shift to how he was handled in the primary versus the general somewhat. Even CNN and other networks are not carrying just his plane sitting there anymore, maybe as much, you know, but but definitely not the way it was. So that's one thing, but the other thing, the media reckoning, the other thing that your last comments here just made me think about too, though, is this reckoning of rural, poor white America, lower middle class white America, and the economic strains that are there that are very real that he has also helped. So in some ways, I see there are moments of reckoning here created by this candidacy that are beneficial to the public dialogue as long as he doesn't destroy American institutions.
Yeah, but I mean, I would say, I'll get to the white rurals in a second. I think one of the good things is, you know, we've talked about this in other venues, where it's in 2009 when Obama's sworn in, it's freezing, everyone's elated, and post-racial. That's the buzzword of the year, and it was so infuriating and frustrating because it was virtually impossible that anyone would believe that this country overnight, with the election of one person, is all of a sudden post-racial. We have systemic, institutional, racist structures that are still in place that make this country completely not post-racial. I think one of the good things about Donald Trump is that he has exposed what a farce that has been. And even though people were on pins and needles waiting to see if something catastrophic happened after Obama got elected. And nothing did, really, right? So it seemed like business as usual, and that's why lots of people patted themselves on the back, saying it was post-racial. There's just been a lag of 8 years where it is so obvious that the Obama backlash is real and that the anger and angst and ire that is in this country is substantive. And so, you know, people who have been studying it and writing about it and talking about it have not been crazy. And I think that actually has been really helpful because a lot of people knew that it was there. They could feel it, they understood it, but it wasn't out in the open. And now it's out in the open, and I think a lot of people, it's like, now you know, either you're with us or against us in a lot of ways, and unfortunately that's the way the country seems to be right now. But like, you now know who allies are. You now know who supports these types of beliefs, all the anti-isms.
Mm-hmm. We're in our final minute here, so we'll...
It's very important in this election to think about what's new and what's not. Why is this like other elections and unlike other elections? It is unlike other elections because that bigotry is front, center, accepted. It's, as you say, a safe space for people like that. That's unlike other elections. It is like other elections because almost every election we talk about low-income white people, right? We talk about those people a lot. We actually have presidents who try to craft solutions. We have candidates who try to win those votes through appeals on social issues, on racial issues. These voters, because there's a lot of them, have been at the center of our politics for a long time, and they haven't been voting Democrat since Johnson, right? So there's this narrative that Trump pulled these voters away from the Democratic Party, and this is something the Democratic Party, that just does not stand up unto the most basic objective analysis.
Well, we're going to leave it there. Thank you for all your thoughts. There's a lot that we discussed to look for on election night and a whole lot more that we didn't get to, but thank you for the discussion. Thank you to Lincoln and Christina for being here, and thank you for watching this election edition of Represent NYC on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm Ben Max. Goodbye.